I welcome Diedrich Diederichsen to our talks on the Anthropocene. Diedrich Diederichsen is one of the few public intellectuals we have in Germany, I must say, and welcome, Diedrich.
Thank you.
Diedrich Diederichsen is one of the curators of the WholeEarth exhibition we have at the moment at the HKW. And this is part of a bigger project we call the Anthropocene project. And one major idea or one major image in the Anthropocene discourse is the idea of the whole. Because the thesis basically says that human beings changed the earth as a whole to such an extent that what we looked at as nature is not anymore nature but already man-made, so that we as human beings have an impact on the whole of Earth. And then the question arises, how can we deal with this wholeness? The exhibition ends with the Adorno note, the whole is the untrue. Mm-hmm. How would you relate, let's say, this note, which to some extent is a reflection on what the exhibition is illustrating or narrating, to the Anthropocene thesis?
Well, I think at the first glance, the Anthropocene thesis seems to ask the question or draw the distinction between nature and history in a new way. It seems to say nature is no longer what we cannot dispose about, but we cannot have no influence upon, which is not man-made, and history is the man-made. And now, obviously, nature seems to be man-made. But the conception of history as what is man-made is, I think, rather what has been kind of intentionally made, what has been made by subjects, for better or worse. It includes the dimension of responsibility, but also the dimension of progress and things like that. Whereas the Anthropocene thesis is not saying man has during historical times created this in a sense of history, but man has produced it as involuntarily as a species, as part of nature and not as part of history. Yeah. So it kind of introduces another dimension of the historical existence of humans.
Would you say perspectivize human beings as natural beings?
Well, as I mean, that depends on how you interpret the thesis, and of course, there is a danger to kind of just cancel out history, yeah, and to ahistoricize human existence on the planet and naturalize it again, for better or worse. But to cancel out the idea of a historical perspective. But I think that the Adorno sentence that the whole is the untrue is about two things. One is that wholeness is a philosophical concept which includes or excludes whatever it wants. There's no reason to think of the Earth as a whole, and then what is the moon, or where does it end, or what does it include in dimensions of existence? What is a relevant dimension of existence? But that is the one thing. Sorry, yeah, the other thing is that there's no reason to think that once something becomes global, it is closed, as the wholeness dimension suggests.
But the story the exhibition tells is, to some extent, at least one can read it like this, that when the last frontier on the Earth was reached, namely California, and human beings started to look in the fourth dimension, meaning the space, and then went into space and looked back on the Earth, that this image, to some extent, reflects also in experience of being immersed in the whole, that there are no limits anymore.
Exactly.
I think this is, from that perspective, what does this quote means?
Well, first, this perspective, what has come to an end there, is not necessarily an expansion of the mind, of curiosity, of intellectual progress, but it is mainly colonization. That is the instrumental gaze upon Earth that exploits Earth and its inhabitants, and that has come to an end. And one can easily say that once you turn around from that perspective and you enter a new dimension or a new perspective towards it, which is not necessarily longer a colonial one, or it starts to colonize something completely different, either space or the inner self or the interior, and that of course is something that immaterial labor in the meantime has started to exploit. But I think the Adorno quote is only about the misconception of any totality as true. Yeah. That is, it is against the false is to assume a totality.
Yeah, it's basically articulating the point that whoever is claiming there is a totality brings in already interests, perspectives in this, because the question is who defines the whole. Mm-hmm. So all arguments of wholeness to some extent try to what is the English word for it? Try to exclude a political perspective.
Mm-hmm, exactly. If we look back at, for example, history of utopias in the late 19th, early 20th century that respond to modernization symptoms of division of labor, Taylorism, industrialization, metropolitanization. You have all these ideologies of wholeness that explicitly talk about this. They talk about the whole person, the whole human being. They talk about overcoming the distinction between hand and mind. And of course, these are all highly ideological movements, and basically even the Nazi ideology has been influenced by those things. And of course, wholeness has these two problems. It is a problem of always excluding something. That's what we see today, because inclusion is such an issue if you look at the contemporary world, and it has the other problem of being arbitrary. You know?
Yes. But coming back or becoming a bit more concrete, when you started your career as a public intellectual, as I said, that was basically in the 80s in the context of punk movement, was very important at the time. From that perspective, how did you look on the 60s, 70s, and perhaps also with a reference to the development of music, because music was a major frame you were developing your discourse in?
Well, before I was a sympathizer of the punk movement, I was a sympathizer of the hippie movement. So, although very young, I was very influenced and impressed, especially by the Californian hippie culture, and I saw the Grateful Dead when they were playing in Europe in '72, and I listened to them in other San Francisco groups, and I was reading beatnik literature, but also Gary Snyder and Timothy Leary and a lot of those people that we talk about in this exhibition. I liked the Fox and Ed Sanders and so on. But on the other hand, I also was involved in hippie culture at that time in Germany, and I also was kind of by 74, 75, 76, I was confronted with its discontents, to call it that, and discovered itself as ideological. And I can remember a strong component of it becoming ideological, in my understanding, was in Hamburg in the mid-70s, the people from the Automühl commune had a big influence, and and this was obviously some kind of late result of hippie culture, and it was obvious how it became kind of terrorist in a way. Yeah?
But how would you describe this transition of being, let's say, a countercultural movement to becoming ideological in itself?
It was obviously the component of love and sexuality in it. It was that you were kind of forced to love. You were supposed to not just love was not a choice. It is an old hippie thing that there's mandatory love of mankind, and that was I think is the ideological Achilles heel of hippie culture, because it was not based on the liberation of a formerly oppressed sexuality alone, which was a component, of course, but it immediately organized new states, and they were based on a notion of the body, the other, the person, that became normative.
Yes.
And so punk was, of course, immediately a culture of separation,
yes,
of fragmentation, of being different. Even with yourself, not being authentic.
Yeah.
That was all the crucial
but
elements.
This normative aspect was there right from the beginning, or you would say at the beginning it was more a practice which became then normative in the process?
It had to become normative because it was an ideological contradiction. Of course, you cannot order someone to love. But on the other hand, that was the basis of this universalism. So once this did not happen, you had to order it, and that is why it had to happen logically. But it did not happen from the beginning on, because the liberation component was stronger in the beginning, and only when what was organized on the basis of liberation had to become stable, successful, economically successful, then the normativities came in.
Exactly. And one aspect where this contradiction becomes evident is that on the one side, the hippie philosophy is arguing for this equality amongst people. On the other side, a major trope in the pop culture is the hero. So is that, how did they deal with this contradiction in itself right from the beginning?
Well, I think there were these paradoxical egalitarian heroes in like, let's say, what was the core hippie culture. Someone like Jerry Garcia, who was a hero but never this kind of fetishized star, and this there was an awareness of that problem. But on the other hand, when it was kind of communicated globally and became to take roots in all kinds of culture during the 70s, all kind of, I don't know, churches and gurus. I think the gurus are far more problematic than the cultural heroes.
Yes.
Emerged, and it is no wonder that one of the most interesting and highly dialectical songs of the punk culture was "No More Heroes" by the Stranglers, which was at one point an anti-hero song, but in it as a slogan. But on the other hand, it was complaining about the loss of the good heroes, like in this Leo Trotsky, Sancho Panza.
Would you say this kind of contradiction we just described, let's say, in the cultural field, to some extent was also reflected in the technological development? Because the driving force of the technological development in the 60s, 70s evidently was this cybernetic thinking. And in the cybernetic thinking, basically, you are always only thinking in network relationships, in relationship terms, also between man and machine. But at the same time, when one looks at the exhibition, one has the impression there were big subjects driving this process. To some extent, heroes. Stuart Brand would be one of them.
I think the main problem of the cybernetization was not so much that it was self-contradictory and that there were big subjects running it, but that it is supposed that it assumes the humans involved in it to be kind of based on an energy production desire level, which is far more stable and rational than it really is, or than it should be in a kind of emancipated context. It assumes them to be to be productive when they can somehow do what they want or do what they're supposed to do, and this wanting something, or this in being involved, being identified, giving energy has to do with if they are identified with their job as in immaterial labor and in neoliberal production, then they would their energy, their identification, their emotional part can be subject to exploitation and surplus value production, just as human labor force has been before. And this is not true, because this is again this they have to love in this. They have to. They have. It is normative that they identify. It is normative that they are emotionally with it, and that is something that cybernetics assume, but it doesn't go with the.
So you would say already in the original culture, there is a kind of instrumentalization of the whole emotional part of human beings, which is then easily to be translated, let's say, in the business world.
Yeah, I don't know if it's already there in the culture, but it's there when it is touched by cybernetics, or when cybernetical models of I don't know, involvement of humans in production processes apply. From that point onwards, it is it is assumed that the identified person is a stable number, a stable, calculable part of a cybernetic process, and it's not.
Let's at the end, to get into the exhibition a bit more. There are two aspects which are, from my perspective, very interesting with this exhibition. The one is that on the one side, you are telling, to some extent, a linear story out of an outside perspective. It seems to be that you even take a kind of Hegelian perspective on world history through California. At the other side, you are exactly criticizing this perspective. Is that true?
To an extent, it is true, which is, I would say, a historical distance, because because most of this we stopped somehow in the mid '80s, and that can be I think safely be called distance. But on the other hand, I don't think that we position ourselves as uninvolved, and by including so many kind of emotionalized cultural items that are neither positioned or framed as artworks nor as just documents, but as something in between, as kind of cultural symptoms, and that's especially true for some of the music, but not only for the music. I think there's another trace in that in the exhibition, which is somehow representing our kind of own limited but involved subjectivity, and not just the kind of historical decisions and interpretations that we also made.
Yeah, that's the other aspect. When you go into the exhibition, you could read it as a kind of book in space, which has certain kind of windows. There are the artworks. These are evidently your, let's say, subjective takes on the narrative, and of course there is a music part in it. How would you describe the role of the music part in it, which is quite specific experience when you are in such a clear, defined space and listen to this music?
Well, I mean, I think that there is music in it which is included in the narrative, and those points, I think it's about pop songs that are in the historical time, in the moment when they come out, already are able to articulate something that hasn't been articulated at the time, some kind of observation, but they do not articulate it as a thought. They are, of course, not philosophers who are outside of time, but they are articulating a connection, a constellation, which has not been articulated by the intellectuals of the time. That is, for example, the case in The End of the Doors, which says exactly, here is a limit, and at the same time, a limitless space is opened. That is something that is one of the guiding motives of our curating that show, and it is obviously a moment in that historical, but it hasn't been articulated then, except in songs like that. And that's one role the music plays. The other one is that we have music as a form of art that has been talking about subjective aspect, like you say, just like the other artworks do. But these are two different. This is music that's not included in the narratives, but which has its own place.
One could say the exhibition is articulating a kind of universalism which comes out of a very local situation, which was California in the 60s, 70s. How was this relation to, let's say, the situation in Europe and Germany at that time?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because you have in California two places that are universal or supposed to be universal or claim to be universal and are clearly localizable. One is Hollywood and the other is San Francisco with Silicon Valley and Berkeley. You know, so that I think they are both there. So that's and they are both producers of universality or universalisms in a very specific place. Whereas I think the European situation is very different because it was a very new thing in the Europe of the 60s that people from different metropolises and cities and centers even were aware of each other. They were local and the movements were local. Even the radical art movements of the 50s were very local. The Viennese group and the Situationists didn't know each other, although they did similar things. The lettrists didn't know about concrete poetry in other parts of the world, although they came up with similar ideas. And even in 68, it took some time before there were Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was in Paris and Frankfurt, was a singular person. There was not much exchange between these places, and so when there was another place in the world where a notion of universality was produced, a notion of universality that was useful for those still relatively localized, local movements, that was kind of adopted. That this was a global use revolt was not necessarily was nothing that people were so much aware of when they were founding the Subversive Action in 1964, which was kind of a predecessor of the SDS in Germany. So I think the political 68 movement in Europe borrowed notions of globality and universality from Californian hippie culture.
Would you say, basically this is a story of California after the Second World War. Would you say that this rise of this universalism is also directly related to the United States becoming a world power?
Yeah, not only the United States becoming a world power, but several kind of global enterprises becoming powerful. Like rock and roll, for example, was a cultural movement that reached a part of the world which was much larger than any other movement before did, and people were aware of it. different from the fact that Tokyo avant-garde of 1956 did something similar to Buenos Aires avant-garde of 1956, but they were not aware of it. But in rock and roll, this was different. And at the same time, on the side of power, you could also say that there were, although the official notion was that there's a separated, split world, Soviets and Americans were both interested in cybernetics. They were both interested in behaviorism. They had similar ideas of technological progress, and they both started a space program. Not only because they were competitors in the same field, but because that was obviously came with the global situation.
Thank you very much.